The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, retold by Kieran McGovern.
Chapter 1. The room was filled with the smell of roses. Sitting on a sofa, smoking a cigarette, was Lord Henry Wotton. Through the open door came the distant sounds of the London streets. In the centre of the room stood a portrait of an extraordinarily beautiful young man. Sitting a little distance in front of it was the artist himself, Basil Hallward. As the painter looked at the portrait, he smiled. "It is your best work, Basil, the best thing you have ever done," said Lord Henry slowly. "You really must send it next year to the Grosvenor. The Grosvenor is really the only place to exhibit a painting like that." "I don't think I shall send it anywhere," the painter answered, moving his head in that odd way that used to make his friends laugh at him at Oxford University. "No, I won't send it anywhere." Lord Henry looked at him in surprise through the thin blue smoke of his cigarette. "Not send it anywhere? My dear man, why not? What odd people you painters are." "I know you will laugh at me," Basil replied, "but I really can't exhibit it. I have put too much of myself into it." Lord Henry stretched himself out on the sofa and laughed. "Too much of yourself in it? Basil, this man is truly beautiful. He does not look like you." "You don't understand me, Harry," answered the artist. "Of course I am not like him. I would be sorry to look like him. It is better not to be different from other people. The stupid and ugly have the best of this world. Dorian Gray—" "Dorian Gray? Is that his name?" asked Lord Henry, walking across the room towards Basil Hallward. "Yes, that is his name. I wasn't going to tell you." "But why not?" "Oh, I can't explain. When I like people enormously, I never tell their names to anyone. I suppose you think that's very foolish?" "Not at all," answered Lord Henry. "Not at all, my dear Basil. You forget that I am married, so my life is full of secrets. I never know where my wife is, and my wife never knows what I am doing. When we meet, we tell each other lies with the most serious faces." "I hate the way you talk about your married life, Harry," said Basil Hallward, walking towards the door that led into the garden. "I believe you are really a very good husband, but that you are ashamed of it. You never say a good thing, and you never do a wrong thing." Lord Henry laughed, and the two men went out into the garden together. After a pause, Lord Henry pulled out his watch. "I am afraid I have to go, Basil," he said in a quiet voice. "But before I go, I want you to explain to me why you won't exhibit Dorian Gray's picture. I want the real reason." "I told you the real reason." "No, you did not. You said that it was because there was too much of yourself in it. Now, that is childish." "Harry," said Basil Hallward, looking him straight in the face, "every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not the sitter. I will not exhibit this picture because I am afraid that I have shown in it the secret of my own soul." Lord Henry laughed. "And what is that?" he asked. "Oh, there is really very little to tell, Harry," answered the painter, "and I don't think you will understand. Perhaps you won't believe it." Lord Henry smiled and picked a flower from the grass. "I am quite sure I'll understand it," he replied, staring at the flower, "and I can believe anything." "The story is simply this," said the painter. 2 months ago, I went to a party at Lady Brandon's. After I had been in the room for about 10 minutes, I suddenly realized that someone was looking at me. I turned around and saw Dorian Gray for the first time. When our eyes met, I felt the blood leaving my face. I knew that this boy would become my whole soul, my whole art itself. What did you do? We were quite close, almost touching. Our eyes met again. I asked Lady Brandon to introduce me to him. What did Lady Brandon say about Mr. Dorian Gray? Oh, something like, "Charming boy. I don't know what he does. I think he doesn't do anything. Oh, yes, he plays the piano. Or is it the violin, dear Mr. Gray?" Dorian and I both laughed, and we became friends at once. "Laughter is not at all a bad beginning for a friendship," said the young lord, picking another flower. "And it is the best ending for one." Hallward shook his head. "You don't understand what friendship is, Harry. Everyone is the same to you." "That's not true," cried Lord Henry, pushing his hat back and looking at the summer sky. "I choose my friends for their beauty, and my enemies for their intelligence. A man cannot be too careful in choosing his enemies. Of course, I hate my relations, and I hate poor people because they are ugly, stupid, and drunk." "I don't agree with a word you have said, and I feel sure that you don't agree either." Lord Henry touched his pointed brown beard with his finger, and the toe of his boot with his stick. "How English you are, Basil. An Englishman is only interested in whether he agrees with an idea, not whether it is right or wrong. But tell me more about Mr. Dorian Gray. How often do you see him?" "Every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day." "How extraordinary. I thought you only cared about your art." "He is all my art to me now," said the painter. "I know that the work I have done since I met Dorian Gray is the best work of my life. In some strange way his personality has shown me a new kind of art. He seems like a little boy, though he is really more than 20, and when he is with me, I see the world differently." "Basil, this is extraordinary. I must see Dorian Gray." Hallward got up from his seat and walked up and down the garden. After some time he came back. "Harry," he said, "Dorian Gray is the reason for my art. You might see nothing in him. I see everything in him." "Then why won't you exhibit his portrait?" asked Lord Henry. "An artist should paint beautiful things, but he should put nothing of his own life into them. Some day I will show the world what that beauty is. For that reason the world will never see my portrait of Dorian Gray." "I think you are wrong, Basil, but I won't argue with you. Tell me, is Dorian Gray very fond of you?" The painter thought for a few moments. "He likes me," he answered after a pause. "I know he likes me. Of course, I flatter him too much, and tell him things that I should not. He is usually very charming to me, and we spend thousands of wonderful hours together. But sometimes he can be horribly thoughtless, and seems to enjoy causing me pain. Then I feel, Harry, that I have given my whole soul to someone who uses it like a flower to put in his coat on a summer's day." "Summer days are long, Basil," said Lord Henry in a quiet voice. "Perhaps you will get bored before he will. Intelligence lives longer than beauty. One day you will look at your friend, and you won't like his colour or something, and then you will begin to think that he has behaved badly towards you." "Harry, don't talk like that. As long as I live, Dorian Gray will be everything to me. You can't feel what I feel. You change too often." "My dear Basil, that is exactly why I can feel it." Lord Henry took a cigarette from his pretty silver box and lit it. Then he turned to Hallward and said, "I have just remembered." "Remembered what, Harry?" "Where I heard the name of Dorian Gray." "Where was it?" asked Hallward with a frown. "Don't look so angry, Basil. It was at my aunt's, Lady Agatha's. She told me that she had discovered this wonderful young man. He was going to help her work with the poor people in the East End of London, and his name was Dorian Gray. Of course, I didn't know it was your friend." "I am very glad you didn't, Harry." "Why?" "I don't want you to meet him." A servant came into the garden. "Mr. Dorian Gray is waiting in the house, sir," he said. "You must introduce me now," cried Lord Henry, laughing. The painter turned to his servant. "Ask Mr. Gray to wait, Parker. I will come in a few moments." Then he looked at Lord Henry. "Dorian Gray is my dearest friend," he said. "He is a beautiful person. Don't spoil him. Don't try and influence him. Your influence would be bad. Don't take away from me the one person who makes me a true artist." "What silly things you say," said Lord Henry. Smiling, he took Hallward by the arm and almost led him into the house. Chapter 2. As they entered, they saw Dorian Gray. He was sitting at the piano with his back to them, and he was turning the pages of some music by Schumann. "You must lend me these, Basil," he cried. "I want to learn them. They are perfectly charming." "Perhaps if you sit well for me today, Dorian." "Oh, I am bored with sitting, and I don't want a portrait of myself," answered the boy, turning quickly. When he saw Lord Henry, his face went red for a moment. "I am sorry, Basil. I didn't know that you had anyone with you." "This is Lord Henry Wotton, Dorian. He's an old friend of mine. We went to Oxford together. I have just been telling him what a good city you were, and now you have spoiled everything." "You have not spoiled my pleasure in meeting you, Mr. Gray," said Lord Henry, stepping forward and offering his hand. "My aunt has often spoken to me about you." "I am afraid Lady Agatha is annoyed with me at the moment. I promised to go to a club in Whitechapel with her last Tuesday, and I forgot all about it. I don't know what she will say to me." Lord Henry looked at him. Yes, he was certainly wonderfully handsome, with his curved red lips, honest blue eyes, and gold hair. "Oh, don't worry about my aunt. You are one of her favourite people, and you are too charming to waste time working for poor people." Lord Henry sat down on the sofa and opened his cigarette-box. The painter was busy mixing colours and getting his brushes ready. Suddenly he looked at Lord Henry and said, "Harry, I want to finish this picture today. Would you think it very rude of me if I asked you to go away?" Lord Henry smiled and looked at Dorian Gray. "Shall I go, Mr. Gray?" he asked. "Oh, please don't, Lord Henry. I see that Basil is in one of his difficult moods, and I hate it when he is difficult, and I want you to tell me why I should not help the poor people." "That would be very boring, Mr. Gray. But I certainly will not run away if you do not want me to. Is that all right, Basil? You have often told me that you like your sitters to have someone to talk to." Hallward bit his lip. "If that is what Dorian wants. Dorian always gets what he wants." Lord Henry picked up his hat and gloves. "No, I am afraid I must go. Goodbye, Mr. Gray. Come and see me one afternoon in Curzon Street. I am nearly always at home at 5 o'clock. Basil," cried Dorian Gray, "if Lord Henry Wotton goes, I will go too. You never open your lips while you are painting, and it is horribly boring just standing here. Ask him to stay." "All right. Please stay, Harry, for Dorian and for me," said Hallward, staring at his picture. "It is true that I never talk when I am working, and never listen either. It must be very boring for my sitters. Sit down again, Harry, and Dorian, don't move about too much, or listen to what Lord Henry says. He has a very bad influence over all his friends." Dorian Gray stood while Hallward finished his portrait. He liked what he had seen of Lord Henry. He was so different to Basil, and he had such a beautiful voice. After a few moments he said to him, "Have you really a very bad influence, Lord Henry? As bad as Basil says?" "Influence is always bad." "Why?" "Because to influence someone is to give them your soul. Each person must have his own personality." "Turn your head a little more to the right, Dorian," said the painter. He was not listening to the conversation, and only knew that there was a new look on the boy's face. "And yet," continued Lord Henry in his low, musical voice, "I believe that if one man lived his life fully and completely, he could change the world. He would be a work of art greater than anything we have ever imagined. But the bravest man among us is afraid of himself. You, Mr. Gray, are very young, but you have had passions that have made you afraid, dreams—" "Stop!" cried Dorian Gray. "I don't understand what you're saying. I need to think." For nearly 10 minutes he stood there with his lips open and his eyes strangely bright. The words that Basil's friend had spoken had touched his soul. Yes, there had been things in his boyhood that he had not understood. He understood them now. With his smile, Lord Henry watched him. He knew the exact moment when to say nothing. He was surprised at the sudden effect of his words on the boy. How fascinating the boy was. Hallward continued painting, and did not notice that the others were silent. "Basil, I am tired," cried Dorian Gray suddenly. "I must go and sit in the garden. There is no air in here." "My dear boy, I am sorry. When I'm painting, my work is all I can think about. But you never sat better. I don't know what Harry has been saying to you, but there is a wonderful bright look in your eyes. I suppose he has been flattering you. You shouldn't believe a word he says." "He has certainly not been flattering me. Perhaps that is why I don't believe anything he has told me." "You know you believe it all," said Lord Henry, looking at him with his dreamy eyes. "I will go out to the garden with you. It's horribly hot in this room." "Don't keep Dorian too long," said the painter. "This is going to be my best painting." Lord Henry went out to the garden and found Dorian Gray holding a flower to his face. He came close to him and put his hand on his shoulder. Dorian Gray frowned and turned away. He liked the tall young man who was standing by him. His dark, romantic face interested him. There was something in his low, musical voice that was fascinating. But he felt a little afraid. Why was this stranger having a strong influence on him like this? He had known Basil Hallward for months, but the friendship between them had not changed him. Suddenly someone had come into his life and turned it upside down. Someone who seemed to have the key to the mystery of life itself. And yet, what was there to be afraid of? He was not a schoolboy or a girl. It was silly to be afraid. "Let us go and sit out of the sun. I don't want you to be burnt by the sun." "What does that matter?" cried Dorian Gray, laughing as he sat down on the seat at the end of the garden. "It should matter very much to you, Mr. Gray."
"Why?"
"Because you are young, and to be young is the best thing in the world."
"I don't feel that, Lord Henry."
"No, you don't feel it now. Some day when you are old and ugly, you will feel it terribly. Now, wherever you go, you charm the world. Will it always be so? You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray."
"I don't think—"
"Don't frown. It is true. The gods have been good to you. But what the gods give, they quickly take away. You have only a few years in which to really live, perfectly and fully. Live your life now, while you are still young."
Suddenly the painter appeared at the door and waved at them to come in. They turned to each other and smiled. "I am waiting," he cried. "Please come in. The light is perfect." They got up and walked towards the house together.
"You are glad you have met me, Mr. Gray," said Lord Henry, looking at him.
"Yes, I am glad now. I wonder whether I will always be glad."
"Always, that is a terrible word. Women are so fond of using it."
20 minutes later, Hallward stopped painting. He stood back and looked at the portrait for a few moments. Then he bent down and signed his name in red paint on the bottom left-hand corner. "It is finished," he cried. Lord Henry came over and examined the picture. It was certainly a wonderful work of art.
"My dear man," he said, "it is the best portrait of our time. Mr. Gray, come over and look at yourself."
Dorian walked across to look at the painting. When he saw it, his cheeks went red with pleasure. He felt that he recognized his own beauty for the first time.
But then he remembered what Lord Henry had said. His beauty would only be there for a few years. One day he would be old and ugly.
"Don't you like it?" cried Hallward, not understanding why the boy was silent.
"Of course he likes it," said Lord Henry. "It is one of the greatest paintings in modern art. I will pay anything you ask for it. I must have it."
"It is not mine to sell, Harry."
"Whose is it?"
"Dorian's, of course," answered the painter.
"He is very lucky."
"How sad it is," said Dorian Gray, who was still staring at his own portrait. "I will grow old and horrible, but this painting will always stay young. It will never be older than this day in June. If only it were the other way."
"What do you mean?" asked Hallward.
"If I could stay young and the picture grow old, for that, I would give everything. Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that."
"I don't think you would like that, Basil," cried Lord Henry, laughing.
"I certainly would not, Harry," said Hallward. Dorian Gray turned and looked at him. "You like your art better than your friends." The painter stared in surprise. Why was Dorian speaking like that? What had happened? His face was red, and he seemed quite angry. "You will always like this painting. But how long will you like me? Until I start getting old. Lord Henry Wotton is perfectly right. When I lose my beauty, I will lose everything. I shall kill myself before I get old." Hallward turned white and caught his hand. "Dorian, Dorian," he cried, "don't talk like that. I have never had a friend like you, and I will never have another. How can you be jealous of a painting? You are more beautiful than any work of art." "I am jealous of everything whose beauty does not die. I am jealous of the portrait you have painted of me. Why should it keep what I must lose?" Hot tears came into his eyes as he threw himself on the sofa. "You did this, Harry," said the painter angrily. Lord Henry shook his head. "It is the real Dorian Gray. That is all." "Harry, I can't argue with two of my best friends at once. Between you both, you have made me hate the best piece of work I have ever done. I will destroy it." Dorian Gray watched as Hallward walked over to the painting table and picked up a knife. The boy jumped from the sofa, tore the knife from Hallward's hand, and threw it across the room. "Don't, Basil!" he cried. "Don't murder it!" "I am glad that you like my work at last, Dorian," said the painter coldly. "I never thought you would." "Like it? I am in love with it, Basil. It is part of myself. I feel that."
"What silly people you are, both of you," said Lord Henry. "Let's forget about the painting for one night and go to the theatre."
"I would like to come to the theatre with you, Lord Henry."
"And you will come too, won't you, Basil?"
"I can't," said Hallward. "I have too much work to do."
"Well, you and I will go together, Mr. Gray." The painter bit his lip and walked over to the picture.
"I will stay with the real Dorian," he said sadly. Chapter 3. One afternoon, a month later, Dorian Gray was sitting in the little library of Lord Henry's house in Mayfair. Lord Henry had not yet come in. He was always late. Dorian Gray was bored, and once or twice he thought of going away. At last he heard a step outside, and the door opened. "How late you are, Harry," he said. "I am afraid it is not Harry, Mr. Gray. It is only his wife." He looked around quickly and got to his feet. "I am sorry. I thought—" "I know you quite well by your photographs. I think my husband has got 17 of them." 17, Lady Henry? Well, 18 then. And I saw you with him the other night at the theatre. But here is Harry." Lord Henry smiled at them both.
"So sorry I am late, Dorian."
"I am afraid I must go," said Lady Harry. "Goodbye, Mr. Gray." "Goodbye, Harry. You are eating out, I suppose? I am too. Perhaps I will see you later."
"Perhaps, my dear," said Lord Harry, shutting the door behind her. Then he lit a cigarette and threw himself down on the sofa. "Never marry a woman with fair hair, Dorian," he said.
"Why, Harry?"
"Because they are romantic."
"But I like romantic people."
"Never marry at all, Dorian."
"I don't think I will marry, Harry. I am too much in love."
"Who are you in love with?" asked Lord Henry after a pause.
"With an actress," said Dorian Gray.
"How ordinary."
"You would not say that if you saw her, Harry."
"Who is she?"
"Her name is Sibylvane."
"I've never heard of her."
"No one has. People will some day, though. She is an artist."
"My dear boy, no woman is an artist. Women never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. How long have you known her?"
"About 3 weeks."
"And where did you meet her?"
"I will tell you, Harry, but you must not laugh. After all, it was you who gave me a passion to know everything about life. For days after I met you, I searched the streets for beauty. I walked around the East End until I found a dirty little theatre. I see you are laughing. It is horrible of you."
"I am not laughing, Dorian. Go on with your story."
The play was Romeo and Juliet. At first I was annoyed at the thought of seeing Shakespeare in such a terrible place, and when a fat old gentleman came out as Romeo, I nearly walked out. But then I saw Juliet. Harry, she was the loveliest thing I had ever seen in my life.
When did you meet her?
I went back the next night and the night after that. On the third evening, I waited for her outside the theatre.
What was she like?
Sybil? Oh, she was shy and gentle. She is only 17, and there is something of a child in her. She said to me, "You look like a prince. I must call you Prince Charming."
Miss Sybil knows how to flatter you.
Oh, you don't understand her, Harry. She thinks that I am like a person in Shakespeare. She knows nothing of life. Sybil is the only thing I care about.
That is the reason, I suppose, that you never have dinner with me now. I thought it might be something romantic.
My dear Harry, we eat together every day, said Dorian.
You always come very late.
Well, I have to see Sybil play, he cried.
Can you have dinner with me tonight, Dorian?
He shook his head. Tonight she is Ophelia, he answered, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet.
When is she Sibylvane?
Never.
That's good.
Oh, how horrible you are! But when you see her, you will think differently. I want you and Basil to come and watch her tomorrow night. You are certain to recognize that she is wonderful.
All right. Tomorrow evening. Will you see Basil before then, or shall I write to him?
Dear Basil, I haven't seen him for a week. It is rather horrible of me, as he sent me my portrait a few days ago. I love looking at it. Perhaps you should write to him. I don't want to see him alone. He says things that annoy me. He gives me good advice.
Lord Henry smiled. People are very fond of giving away advice they need themselves.
Oh, Basil is a good man, but I don't think he really understands about art and beauty. Since I have known you, Harry, I have discovered that.
Basil, my dear boy, puts everything that is charming in him into his work.
I must go now, Harry. My Juliet is waiting for me. Don't forget about tomorrow. Goodbye.
As Dorian left the room, Lord Henry began to think about what he had just learnt. Certainly few people had ever interested him so much as Dorian Gray. Yet the mad worship of this actress did not make him annoyed or jealous. He was pleased by it. It made the boy more interesting to study. Later that night, when he arrived home from dinner, Lord Henry saw a telegram on the table near the door. He opened it and read that Dorian Gray was going to marry Sibylvane. Chapter 4. "I suppose you have heard the news, Basil," said Lord Henry the following evening. They were in the dining-room of the Bristol Hotel. "No, Harry," answered the artist, giving his hat and coat to the waiter. "What is it?" "Dorian Gray is going to be married," said Lord Henry, watching him as he spoke. Hallward frowned. "Dorian going to be married?" he cried. "Impossible." "It is perfectly true." "To whom?" "To some little actress." "But it would be absurd for him to marry someone like that." "If you want to make him marry this girl, tell him that, Basil. He is sure to do it then. Whenever a man does a completely stupid thing, it is always for a good reason." "I hope this girl is good, Harry." "Oh, she is better than good. She is beautiful," said Lord Henry. "Dorian says that she is beautiful, and he is not often wrong about these things. Your portrait has helped him understand beauty in others. We are to see her tonight, if that boy doesn't forget."
"But how can Dorian marry an actress, Harry? It is absurd," cried the painter, walking up and down the room, biting his lip. "Dorian Gray falls in love with a beautiful actress who plays Juliet. He asks her to marry him. Why not? I hope that Dorian Gray marries this girl and worships her for 6 months. Then he can suddenly become fascinated by another woman." "You don't mean a word of that, Harry. I know you don't really want Dorian Gray's life to be spoiled. You are much better than you pretend to be." Lord Henry laughed. "The reason we all like to think so well of others is because we are afraid for ourselves. But here is Dorian himself. He will tell you more than I can." "My dear Harry, my dear Basil, you must both congratulate me," said the boy, throwing off his coat and shaking each of his friend's hands. "I have never been so happy. Of course, it is sudden. All the best things are. And yet it seems to me to be the one thing I have been looking for all my life." "I hope you will always be very happy, Dorian," said Hallward. "But why did you not tell me? You told Harry." "There really is not much to tell," cried Dorian. "Last night I went to see her again. After, when we were sitting together, there came into her eyes a wonderful look. It was something I had never seen there before. We kissed each other. I can't describe to you what I felt at that moment."
"Have you seen her today?" asked Lord Henry.
Dorian Gray shook his head. "I have left her in Shakespeare's forest. I will find her in his garden."
"At what exact point did you use the word marry, Dorian? And how did she answer? Perhaps you forgot all about it."
"My dear Harry, it was not a business meeting. I told her I loved her. The whole world is nothing to me compared to her."
"But, my dear Dorian—" Hallward put his hand on Lord Henry's arm.
"Don't, Harry. You have annoyed Dorian. He is not like other men. He would never harm anyone."
Lord Henry looked across the table. "Dorian is never annoyed with me," he answered.
Dorian Gray laughed. "When I am with Sibylvane, I don't believe in anything you have taught me. I forget all your fascinating, terrible ideas."
"And those are?" asked Lord Henry, helping himself to some salad.
"Oh, your ideas about life, your ideas about love, your ideas about pleasure. All your ideas, Harry."
"Pleasure is the only thing worth having ideas about," he answered in his slow, musical voice. "When we are happy, we are always good. But when we are good, we are not always happy."
"I know what pleasure is," cried Dorian Gray. "It is to worship someone."
"That is certainly better than when someone worships you."
"Harry, you are terrible. I don't know why I like you so much. Let us go down to the theatre. When you see Sybil, you will change your ideas."
They got up and put on their coats. The painter was silent and thoughtful. He felt very sad. Dorian Gray would never again be to him all that he had been in the past. Life had come between them. When he arrived at the theatre, it seemed to Hallward that he had grown years older.